Hello, my lovely beans. I keep re-recording this hello and welcome, just to kind of, settle into the chapter and that sort of thing. I have been struggling with my voice. That's why it has been a bit of a delay. I cannot abide that it's been a bit of a delay, and I'm really sorry. There's a lot going on here, an awful lot going on. But the thing is, I want to bring you these chapters because I enjoy reading them for you. It's good for me. I know that you like them too. And I'm really, really sorry about the delay. So hopefully we can pull it together. Even if I can just do 10 pages at once, I'll be doing them. But it's not my usual standard, you see. I like to bring you a good quality recording. And if my voice is off, then I feel the recording will be off. But if I try and integrate it into recording a little bit, it might be a bit of fun. Anyway, you love the very bones of you. Thank you all for being here. I do appreciate you very, very, very much. And I appreciate your patience when I'm being as flaky as this, which is not my usual way of doing things, but at the moment just seems to be a bit weird. Okay, so Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Sausages, J.W. Wells & Co. book, the 7 chapter of the 12ishness, which is 12 in Norwegian apparently. Right, okay, we can do this thing. Chapter 12.
Anyway,
said Mr. Horse,
that's all I know about my early life. Sad, isn't it?
Jack Tedeschi nodded vaguely. He'd never thought of himself as a timid sort of guy before. If anything, he was a bit concerned about coming across as a trifle bumptious, a little on the loud and aggressive side, maybe just a mini tad scary to people who didn't know him. It was only now, wedged into a cramped men's toilet, with Mr. Horse looming over him and telling him all this crazy stuff with that wild look in his eye, that Jack realised he was at heart a frightened little animal who wanted nothing more out of life than to find a knife-safe hole in the ground and burrow right down into it as far as he could go.
Very,
he mumbled.
Very sad indeed.
It would have been all right if he hadn't believed what he'd been hearing. The ravings of a loon, even a big, tall loon like Mr. Horse, wouldn't have disturbed him particularly, any more than if he'd been screamed at in the street by a wino. It was the content, not the manner of presentation, that was messing with Jack Tedeschi's head. At first, he'd assumed he was listening to an amnesia story, found unconscious on a Georgian mountainside, pockets stuffed with money, couldn't remember his own name. But as the narrative went relentlessly on, details jumped out at him and hung like bats from the inner fabric of his mind. The steel earrings, for example. The ability to understand any language immediately. The fact that his internal organs weren't where Gray's Anatomy reckoned they ought to be. Really, he didn't like the sound of that at all. Mr. Horse was looking at him contemplatively, either like an artist considering a work in progress or like a spider checking out its silk-wrapped larder. He wasn't quite sure which.
I expect, Mr. Horse said, all that stuff sounds pretty screwy to you.
When all else fails, honesty.
Yes,
said Jack. Mr. Horse grinned like a dog.
You ain't heard nothing yet. Listen. I told you, Mr. Horse said, about the brass ring. What I didn't tell you was that it started acting funny. No, belay that. I'm getting ahead of myself. There I was, in the Caucasus, with nothing except the shirt on my back and $100,000 in cash. Naturally, the first thing I did was invest heavily in real estate. I was lucky right from the start. I bought this forest. I was still living in the hotel at the time, but I could see this forest from my bedroom window, and I just knew I had to have it. So I went to see the owners. They were a timber consortium that was just on the point of going bust. Cash in hand suited them very well, and especially hard currency. We rushed through the formalities. They made themselves scarce. Came over here, actually, settled down. Did quite nicely for themselves. Even bought a football team. And I had my forest, which was all I... Quite, you may well ask. Really, there wasn't a logical reason I could put my finger on, then or now. I just wanted it. Actually, I had this crazy notion there might have been truffles growing in it. Anyway, a week after I'd completed the deal, one of the mega big Russian oil companies came looking for me. Apparently they'd struck oil nearby, and they desperately needed my land for a pipeline. I turned my 100,000 into 10 million, thanked them very, very much, and looked around for something else to put my money into. I won't bore you with the details. Everything I touched came good. I bought swamps, deserts, deserted villages contaminated by nuclear disasters, and within hours there'd be some nutcase desperate to quintuple my money for me, if only I'd sell out to them. It was all so easy, so natural, if you follow me. Like this was what was meant to happen. I really couldn't understand why everybody else on the planet wasn't doing exactly the same thing. Anyway, at the time, life seemed pretty good. Straightforward. Or so I thought. That was when the brass ring started playing up. I used to carry it around with me in a little box. Don't ask me why. It seemed the right thing to do. From time to time, I'd take it out and look at it. Yes, I know what you're thinking, but it wasn't like that at all. I wasn't continually putting it on, and when I did, I didn't vanish or anything like that. Rather, it was as though, just by looking at it, I thought I might remember some stuff from my previous life. It's like when you know there's an answer to some problem that's driving you nuts, and it's staring you in the face, but you can't quite see it. I was absolutely sure that the daft brass ring meant something, and if I studied it hard enough, the penny would eventually drop, and then I would know. But it didn't work out like that. And then the ring started changing. Yes, literally changing. One day it'd be a ring. Next day it would be a nail file, or a 10mm carriage bolt, or a pair of nail scissors, or a bit off an intake valve. I only knew it was really my brass ring because it was in the box. It started to bother me, so instead of carrying it around all the time, I hired a safe deposit box in a bank in Tashkent and left it there. Almost straight away, everything started going down the pan. I bought more swamps and deserts and nuclear disaster sites, but nobody wanted to buy them off me. Deals I'd made earlier started unravelling horribly. The tax people came after me with a vengeance. I managed to piss off some rather heavy people sort of in and around the government. They thought I was political, which I obviously wasn't, but tried getting them to believe that. All in all, I was in a bit of a mess. I did a basic stock take of my assets, liabilities, and life generally, and I realised that I was exactly, to the kopeck, back where I'd started from. I'd lost the 400 million or so I'd made, but I still had 100,000 US in cash in my safe deposit box. That was all that was left. The nasty men had made it pretty damn clear they wanted me to go away somewhere, so that's what I did. Taking the cash and my brass ring with me, I wandered around for a bit, then hit on the UK as a fairly nice place to be. I came here, got off the plane at Heathrow, took a taxi to Slough, and bought a disused sewage farm. Why? Because the derelict warehouse and the burned-out factory site were too much money, of course. Next day, some fixers from a supermarket chain came knocking at my hotel room door and offered me 5 million for my sewage farm. So that was all right. I was back in business. After that, I took a couple of weeks off and did some thinking. Didn't take me long to figure out that my luck depended on having the brass ring on my person at all times. Well, fine, I thought. It's not exactly a hardship. But that was easy enough to say. The fact was, lugging the bloody thing about the place was beginning to prey on my mind really badly. I put up with it for as long as I could, and then I just couldn't hack it any longer. I chucked the ring and the box in a pond in a field out in the middle of nowhere, turned round and kept walking. About an hour later, I got struck by lightning. I remember waking up, and I was on a hillside. I looked round, expecting to see Russian Orthodox monks zooming towards me in a golf buggy. Not this time. Apparently, I was feeling like shit, though there were no bones broken or anything. I got up and walked around for a bit till I came to this farmyard. There didn't seem to be anybody about, and I was dead on my feet, so I crawled inside the first outbuilding I came to and fell asleep. You aren't going to like the next bit, but never mind. While I was asleep, the brass ring appeared to me in a dream. It told me we couldn't go on like this. Using it up at a rate of knots, and if I carried on like that, it'd have to kill me and find someone else. I didn't like the sound of that one bit, so I asked it what it wanted me to do. Easy, it replied. Buy this farm, get planning permission, build a load of houses on it, sell them and make a nice profit. All right, I said, I'll give it a go. And then what? At which the ring gave me a very funny look and said, No, I didn't understand. I was to go on doing that indefinitely, or at least until the ring told me to stop, and then I woke up. You don't argue with something like that. Well, maybe you would, but you've had a rather more conventional upbringing than me. I went back to the pond and splashed about in the mud until I found the box. Then I walked to the nearest town, discovered who owned the farm, and offered him 10 times what it was worth. Planning permission was a breeze, and we started building. And then things started to get weird. Basically, it was like this. We built the houses, and we sold them, and the day after we'd sold the last one, the whole lot vanished. Gone without a trace. I remember walking up to the lane to where the housing estate ought to have been. There was nothing there. Just green grass and hedgerows and birds singing and rabbits scampering about the side of the road, and not a house or JCB or a big pile of bricks to be seen anywhere. Meanwhile, according to the land registry and the council and everybody else who presumably ought to know, I still owned the land and I had full planning consent to build as many houses on it as I could contrive to squeeze in. The only thing that hadn't vanished, in fact, was the money, so naturally I started all over again. I built another housing estate and sold the houses, and sure enough, 24 hours after completion on the final sale, I was right back where I started. Grass, birds, rabbits, deeds, planning, and a tidy sum put aside in the bank for a rainy day. And that, Mr. Horse said, is basically what I've been doing ever since. I've lost count of how many times. Must be 20 at least. Which means I've built and sold hundreds of houses and bungalows and maisonettes and studio apartments, all on the same scrubby little bit of land, and I can't face looking at my bank statements anymore because the thought of all that money makes me feel just a little bit sick. But I don't even think of stopping because every time I do, I get this dream where the ring reminds me of what will happen to me if I don't cooperate. And maybe it's bluffing, and maybe it isn't, but I really don't want to find out which. And that's not all it's made me do. A while back it pointed out to me that I should save a bundle on my wage bill if I hired my legal staff simultaneously rather than consecutively. And I didn't dare argue. I just did as I was told. I haven't got a clue how, but I had about 16 qualified lawyers working for me, and I was only paying 4 lots of wages. And there's only 4 offices in that part of the building. So the land you sold me? Mr. Horse nodded. Same land, he said. Sometimes, just for a change, I'll sell to another developer instead of building on it myself. Makes no odds. As soon as the other guy's built and sold his development, it goes straight back to green fields and gambling wildlife. But nobody's ever complained, Mr. Horse added, and his voice was as taut as a guitar string. That's the bit that gets to me. You know Jimmy Buzek, Greystoke Properties? Sold him the land about 9 months ago. Got it back about 6 weeks later, and I bump into Jimmy all the time, and he's never said a word about our deal. Or Frank Panizzo. He bought the land off me just before Christmas, and apparently he's been going around telling everybody what a good deal he made, and what a right sucker I was to let him have it so cheap. Satisfied customers, in other words. Which was why, he added sadly, I sold it to you, because I had no reason to suppose it wouldn't be perfectly all right. Jack Tedeschi looked at him for a long time, then took a deep breath. Let me get this straight, he said. You've been selling the same bit of land over and over again, and all the houses vanish and nobody minds. Mr. Horse didn't reply, and Jack Tedeschi, usually about as sensitive as a policeman's boot, realised it would probably be best not to press him on the issue. He was a simple man at heart, single-minded, tenacious, not without a considerable degree of basic predator's cunning. But he believed that the world was made up of straight lines, numbers, causes and effects. Now he was in the excruciatingly uncomfortable position of believing 2 things simultaneously. 1, that Mr. Horse was as crazy as 3 ferrets in a blender. 2, that at least some of what he'd just been told was probably true. Faced with something like that, the only course of action he could envisage was to get out of there as quickly as possible, forget everything he'd heard, and get his accountants busy on finding a way of writing off the stupendous sum of money he'd just lost against the tax. Anyway, Mr. Horse was saying, that's what's going on, more or less. For some reason, everything seems to have chosen this particular moment to come unstuck. Bloody nuisance, he added with a death's head grin. I've just had to fire all my in-house lawyers, for one thing. Apparently, they're sort of leaking into one another, and that's more aggravation than I can handle. So I thought the simplest thing would be to get rid of the lot of them. Hopefully all of this will blow over and I can hire them again. I wouldn't want to leave them stranded. They're a good bunch of people by and large. More worrying is that the land seems to have vanished completely. Well, he added, you know that already, don't you? Anyhow, that's about it. He grinned again, then added, you did ask. Yes, Jack said. I did, didn't I? Mr. Horse stood back and unbolted the lavatory door. One thing, he said. Would you mind very much keeping all this to yourself? Only... Jack laughed. A harsh, rasping noise, like a man just saved from drowning coughing up water. No worries on that score, he said. If I tried to tell you what you just told me... He shook his head so hard he nearly sprained something. Safe with me, he said firmly. Just stay away from me, all right? I never want to see or hear from you ever again. Got that? Mr. Horse walked him back to reception. I'm sorry, he said, but Jack just turned his back and lunged out into the street. Mr. Horse sighed and went back to his office, where he called the bank and arranged for Jack's money to be sent back to him. The least he could do, but not nearly enough. Come on, Stan, he said fervently to himself. Where are you when I need you? Mr. Goggerty looked at his watch. It was blank. Where there used to be 3 dials, there was now only a flat sheet of brush-finished stainless steel. Oh, he thought. The train didn't seem to be going particularly fast, but it was definitely moving. He looked out the window, but all he could see was his reflection against a black background. This, he thought, and someone burned down the Carpenter Library. The only possible conclusion, enemy action. If there's enemy action, it stands to reason there must be an enemy. Mr. Goggerty slipped his mind into calm mode and considered what he knew about his presumed assailant. Not very much, but from what little he had, he might be able to build up a profile. Competent, you had to give him that. Burning down the Carpenter couldn't have been easy. Because of the very nature of what was stored there, the building was protected by the highest level of security known to the trade. Admittedly, the biggest concern had always been spontaneous combustion rather than arson, but the defence against that one should have protected it against the other. Unless the arsonist was cunning, resourceful, imaginative, and very, very good indeed at doing the business. As for this other thing, creating a biosignature-specific temporal portal just so Stanley Goggerty could be induced to board a train to 7 years in the future wasn't just impressive, it was showing off. Look how clever I am, his opponent was telling him. You don't want to mess with someone like me. It was also a remarkably humane way of getting rid of him. He couldn't help thinking. There were far worse things, and they were much cheaper and easier to use. If Mr. Goggerty had been called upon to take somebody out, he'd have gone for something like a consequence mine, probability well, better mousetrap or McKinley bomb, tried and tested, devastatingly effective, practically impossible to detect or counter, and, since British law didn't recognise the existence of the profession, perfectly legal, even though the effect on the victim was either fatal or worse. Temporal phase engineering was much harder to do, substantially more expensive, considerably less reliable, and totally forbidden under the trade's own ferociously enforced bylaws. It was also, to someone of Mr. Goggerty's abilities, relatively easy to get out of. Eventually, his enemy therefore was someone who wanted him out of the way for a certain length of time, no pun intended, but who meant him no lasting harm, and who probably wanted to impress on him that he wasn't playing the blind school. Burning down the Carpenter, on the other hand, implied a rather scary degree of ruthlessness. This time, his unknown enemy was telling him, nobody needs to get hurt. Next time, Mr. Goggerty was mildly impressed. He knew quite a lot about his enemy after all. That in itself was significant.
In the small, claustrophobic village of the profession, such a profile narrowed the list of suspects down considerably, and obviously his enemy knew that. It was almost as though Stan was deliberately being offered a set of clues to an identity, a signature, in fact, albeit a little squiggly, illegible doctor's and solicitor's signature that either you recognised or you didn't. "It's somebody I know." Mr. Goggarty's intuition yelled in his inner ear. "Somebody I know quite well. Definitely somebody who knows me. Or else how?" He frowned, leaving the blindingly obvious till last was a fault of his, one that he regretted. The temporal portal had been laid by somebody who could accurately predict his movements. Now that was scary. He'd only taken the tube because he couldn't get a taxi. Refined search parameters. It was pretty unusual that he hadn't been able to get a taxi, since his summoning technology was extremely sophisticated. He reviewed it. Rated grade 6. It was guaranteed to bring him a taxi in Stoke Newington at 3 a.m, within 25 seconds of issuing the summons. A dampening field, therefore. His enemy had neutralised the summons in order for him to take a tube before cutting an access portal through time, so he'd walk into an underground station that wouldn't be built for another 7 years. Leaving aside the quite remarkable achievement this represented, it begged the question of how Mr. Enemy had known which future tube stop to access. The answer to which was that he'd known the direction Stanley Goggarty intended to travel in. Given the ad hoc nature of the decision, whoever it was must have exceptionally accurate, up-to-the-minute information about his plans and intentions. In other words, a tracking device. A bug. Now, where there's a bug, there's a bugger. At some point in the fairly recent past, someone had got close enough to plant a tracking device on him, someone with a strong incentive for hindering his current mission that really narrowed it down, while at the same time throwing it wide open. Someone who'd come within arm's reach of him. Someone who, presumably, really didn't like Mr. Huos. Someone with a grade 9 or higher trade rating. Meanwhile, he decided it would probably be a good idea to stop the train and get off. He got up and walked along the carriage, looking for the red emergency stop button. There wasn't one. That, he had to concede, made things just a little bit awkward. A tube train in motion in an underground tunnel isn't the easiest thing in the world to disembark from. He could smash a window and crawl, jump, fall out, but only if he didn't mind the high probability of being killed or horribly mangled. He tried the connecting door into the next carriage, with a view to getting into the driver's cab. It was locked, and not just with a physical mechanism. When he touched it, it was as though he'd loaded up on LSD and stuck his hand in a bacon slicer. He took a moment to recover, then tried prodding the handle very gently with a pencil, which promptly turned into a green mamba and tried to crawl up his sleeve. He dropped it quickly and retreated to the other end of the compartment. Now someone had put a grade 6 jamming protocol on the door. Laying it on with a trowel, he couldn't help thinking. His respect for this unidentified enemy ratcheted up a notch or two. Eventually, the train would arrive somewhere, because a stable temporal stasis field, although theoretically possible, would be inconceivably expensive to produce, and he'd be able to get off and find his way back to his own proper time and place. Until then, he was forced to concede. He was stuck. Mr. Enemy, it hurt him to admit it, but he had no choice, was better at this sort of thing than he was. Grade 6 jamming protocols. He shuddered and issued a mental apology to his client. "Sorry, Mr. Huos, but you're on your own. Stanley Goggarty is off the case." He sighed, opened his briefcase, took out the forensics report for the Mendoza Consortium inquiry, and began to read. It was fairly engrossing stuff. Maybe he'd been wrong to focus exclusively on the penguins in June angle after all, and he'd read 15 pages before he looked up to discover that there was someone sitting next to him. Mr. Goggarty didn't do double takes or sit in high jumps. Instead, he put the report back in his briefcase and clicked the lock shut before turning his head, taking a long, steady look at the newcomer and saying, "I'm Stanley Goggarty. Who the hell are you?" He'd gone with Who? Mostly out of politeness, but what would have been more appropriate? It was humanoid, more or less. It had arms and legs and a perfectly spherical blob for a head, snowman eyes and an otherwise blank face. A 6-foot 3D gingerbread man badly rendered in CGI. "Hello," it replied. The voice told him what it was. Unlike the body, the voice was packed with information. It had a slight London accent. It sounded male in early 30s, diffident, self-conscious, a bit like it needed to go to the lavatory very soon indeed. Its master's voice, Mr. Goggerty concluded, which meant it was some form of trade artefact, a golem, or Henderson projection, or possibly a good old-fashioned spat-upon hair. "How long have you been sitting there?" Mr. Goggerty asked. "Oh, about 5 minutes," it replied. "I didn't want to disturb you." "Probably not an assassin in that case." "Who sent you?" It opened the slit in its face, but no words came out, and since it had no lips, Mr. Goggerty couldn't lip read. It had been a trick question in any case. Animated proxy artifacts can't do proper nouns. "I see," Mr. Goggerty said. "Well, what can I do for you?" "You must come with me at once," it replied. "Life and death, if convenient." Mr. Goggerty smiled. "I'd like to do that," he said. "Unfortunately, I don't think that'd be possible. This train is." The train was, in fact, slowing down. Mr. Goggerty glanced through the window and saw Victoria in a red circle with a bar through it. As the train drew smoothly to a halt, he checked his watch. 3 dials. "How did you do that?" he asked. It smiled. "I've no idea," it replied. "Follow me, please." Out onto the platform, up the escalator, out onto the street. Oddly enough, none of the hundreds of people swarming about in Victoria Station seemed to notice that Mr. Goggerty's companion was a featureless, asexual, biscuit-coloured nude, or that it didn't have a valid ticket. Outside, it raised its arm above its head, and a taxi immediately drew up beside it, driven, Mr. Goggerty noticed, by what could only be the Thing's identical twin brother. His escort didn't specify an address, but the taxi drove off anyway. Neither of the gingerbread men said a word after that, so Mr. Goggerty took the opportunity to read a bit more of the Mendoza report. He didn't feel in the least apprehensive, which was good. His only regret was that his boyhood promise to his mother not to get into a motor vehicle with strange men was now completely and irrevocably broken. On the plus side, however, according to his watch, he'd re-entered conventional linear time only 3 minutes after he'd left it. To a self-employed man who charged by the hour, that was a small mercy worth being grateful for. The taxi stopped, and Mr. Goggerty looked up and put the report away in his briefcase. He frowned. Now, if he didn't know any better... "Where are we?" he asked. "Here," the Thing replied, with as beautiful a smile as it's possible to produce without a conventional mouth. The taxi door swung open, and Mr. Goggerty got out. Briefly, in the time it would take a photon to travel 20 yards, Mr. Goggerty considered running for it. After all, it hadn't been precisely established whether he'd been A, rescued, or B, abducted, although he suspected it was really C, a bit of both. It was possible, more than possible, given the vicissitudes of his trade, that he'd been brought here by an enemy, though presumably not the enemy who'd removed him briefly on a tube train in the future, and that if he now went where he was led, he'd have cause to regret it. It didn't feel like that, however, and Mr. Goggerty was quite good at sensing impending danger, a talent which explained the fact he'd lived long enough to own more than 6 pairs of shoes. Also, he was confoundedly curious, and if he was right about where he had been brought to... "Follow," said the Thing. "Please," it added, so Mr. Goggerty followed. A glimpse of a street name, and then of the number on the front door, confirmed at least part of his hunch. The interesting question now was which flat in the block he'd be taken to. It also occurred to him to wonder what his enemy, his original enemy, the one who'd planted him on a tracking device, which he hadn't so far been able to identify and remove, was making of all this. The Thing led him up the stairs, with the other Thing, the one who'd been driving the taxi, following on behind at a discreet distance. The number on the door they stopped at answered the most pressing question in his mind, so when the door was opened by a tall, thin, pale young man with long, shaggy hair and glasses, he knew what to say.
"Hello," he said. "You must be Donald Mayer. I'm Stanley Goggerty."
Surprisingly, the young man didn't seem to have been expecting that.
He said. I'm sorry. You're late."
Mr. Goggerty considered him. To survive for any length of time in the profession, it helped to be a good and very, very quick judge of character. Mr. Goggerty's very first impression was that Mr. Mayer was a pretty gormless young man. No, not just gormless, but a black hole into which gorm falls and is utterly consumed. Why he revised that opinion in a fraction of a second later, he wasn't entirely sure, but once the revision had been made, he was quite happy to abide by it. Gormless, yes, but inside the oyster of his gormlessness lurked a tiny seed pearl of something else, which was why, accused of lateness, Mr. Goggerty nodded gravely and said,
"Sorry about that. I was held up. This."
He nodded at the thing.
"I know,"
Mr. Mayer interrupted.
"I sent them, I think,"
he added.
"Huh?"
The two things nodded enthusiastically, then jumped into Mr. Mayer's hand, shrinking as they went. By the time they landed on his palm, they were 2 carrot-red hairs, which Mr. Mayer put back with an embarrassed look, like a man doing up his fly in public.
"I hope they didn't—"
"Not at all,"
Mr. Goggerty replied briskly.
"In fact, they rescued me from a temporal vortex, so I'm much obliged to you. Shall I come in?"
Mr. Mayer looked at him as though he had just been told he'd been chosen to lead the human race in its crusade against the marshmallow people.
He replied. "Sorry, yes."
"After you, then."
"What? Oh, right. This way."
Mr. Goggerty followed, and as he crossed the threshold he felt it, the presence of a trade artifact, something like having your skull squeezed in a bench vice while ants run riot inside your claws. Strong, in fact. He paused to steady himself on the door frame. Now, there aren't any Oscars in the profession. No Emmys, no Pulitzers, no Basil Bookers. They're the Siegfrieds, but they're really only for dragon slaying, vampire kebabbing and the like. Narrator's note, sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know how I said that in one. I'm not going to cut this out. That was funny. Right. Right, I'll try that again. They're the Siegfrieds, but they're really only for dragon slaying, vampire kebabbing and the like, while these days the Merlins are a little more than the popularity contest. Sorry. Well, these days, the Merlins are little more than a popularity contest, a means of recognising the fact that so-and-so's managed to complete 30 years in the trade without being killed, transfigured or imprisoned forever in the heart of a glacier. The only meaningful accolade left is the 4-yearly Shumway Award. Nowadays, it's the Karlstein Lager Bank of the Dead Quagachia Integrated Circuit Shumway Award, presented to the practitioner responsible for a truly significant advance in professional research. Past winners have included Arnie Mortensen, Li Huan Chi, Theo Van Spee, Frank Carpenter and the Shaftgrave sisters, and it's widely recognised as the only gong in the biz that money or threats cannot buy. The irony is that 9 times out of 10, the recipient is some otherwise run-of-the-mill individual who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Mortensen on the steps of the Smithsonian at the exact moment when Krakatoa erupted. Lee history kibitzing in Sir Isaac Newton's garden when the apple parted from the tree and slowly floated upwards. Molly Shaftgrave inadvertently trapped inside her own suitcase at Heathrow Terminal 5 and shipped across the interdimensional void to the parallel universe where Bing Crosby was cast as a man with no name in a fistful of dollars. In the past, Mr. Goggerty had felt bitterly aggrieved at the sheer dumb luck that had brought these losers to the trade's most coveted accolade, knowing full well that he'd never get that lucky. Or maybe The waves of pressure emanating from whatever it was made his ears hum like an extractor fan. Not.
My sister Polly,
said Mr. Mayor, wobbling his hand in the general direction of some female. It was somewhere in this room.
Pleased to meet you,
said Mr. Goggerty, trying not to be too obvious as his eyes flicked from table to floor to ceiling.
You wanted to see me.
That's right, said Mr. Mayor's sister, Polly. There's something really screwy going on, and we want to know how to make it stop. It took Mr. Goggerty quite an effort to remember how to smile.
Screwy is my business,
he said, sitting down on the sofa and only just managing not to groan at the pounding of blood in his forehead.
Tell me all about it.
So she did, and to his credit, Mr. Goggerty managed to concentrate just enough to get the gist of it. A pencil sharpener.
Excuse me, he interrupted. A brass pencil sharpener.
Mr. Mayor nodded eagerly.
Could be brass, yes.
In a box.
What? Sorry, no, there wasn't a box.
I see. Please carry on.
Why not ask to see it? He wasn't sure. Maybe it was just simple fear. Any close to the source of all that energy and the fillings in his teeth would start melting. Maybe subconsciously he was prolonging the moment of triumph, quite possibly the crowning glory of his entire career, or maybe, before he actually confronted the thing, he needed to know what had become of the box. The lifetime achievement Shumway would look just right on his mantelpiece, in between the alabaster Minoan vase and his Uncle Desmond's clock, but boxes don't just vanish. Something, he felt it in his scar tissue, wasn't quite right. Something bad had happened. The upstairs neighbour gone without a trace. Mr. Goggerty twitched in his chair. He'd forgotten all about the occupant of the flat above.
That'd be Mr. Kevin Briggs,
he said calmly. He'd scored a few points with that one. Both of them stared at him, and the female said, "How the hell did you know that?" Other members of the profession reckoned a little showmanship was perfectly legitimate and quite good for business. Fair enough, but not when it gets in the way.
I know about Mr. Briggs, he said. He took some laundry to Speedy Clean in Clevedon Road shortly before.
He paused. Reading his clients' faces was the important part of his business.
The name rings a bell, I take it.
More like an international festival of campanology, the young man muttered. That's the place where Polly took her dress, and then it
disappeared.
Mr. Goggerty nodded.
I know. Let me be perfectly frank with you, Mr. Mayor. Speedy Clean is the main reason I'm here.
Now, the sister, he'd suspected all along she was the brighter of the two, was looking at him. You're searching for it, she said.
I found it, he replied.
He'd intended to be impressive, force of professional habit, and he'd succeeded to the point where he was afraid he was laying himself open to charges of self-indulgence.
I think I'd better level with you both, he said. My client, you'll excuse me if I don't tell you his name, I'm sure you understand why, is extremely anxious to trace a certain object he lost recently. He has reason to believe it was in the pocket of an overcoat he took into Speedy Clean in Clevedon Road. I should point out that this object is capable of doing very strange things.
Magic, the sister said. Mr. Goggerty winced as though he was an admiral, and someone at a party had asked him what kind of boat he drove.
For want of a better word, he said, the important point is this object is potentially very dangerous. In fact,
he added, as Mr. Mayor's face went the colour of a 10-year-old white gloss paintwork,
there's evidence to suggest that this has already been responsible for some extremely unfortunate events, quite apart from the disappearance of your upstairs neighbour. I would therefore urge you most strongly, damn it, Mr. Goggerty thought, I'm starting to sound like a policeman at a press conference. If you can help me find it, he said, you'll be doing me a favour, and my client, and possibly a great many other people as well.
The sister was looking at him again. You think Don's pencil sharpener's this magic thing?
There is that possibility, yes.
Damn it, he'd slipped back into Rosa speak.
If I could just...
You seem to know a lot about it, what it does. Sharp as a bramble, that one.
Mostly guesswork, he said. Even my client, its owner, doesn't actually know what it is or where it came from.
Ms. Mayor nodded. But you know, don't you, we've got a pretty good idea. He made a vague gesture with his arms.
I've never seen this thing, he said. I don't know what it looks like. I haven't seen a picture or anything like that, but...
Is that right? Ms. Mayer was after him now. He decided he didn't like her terribly much. This client of yours hires you to find something for him, but you don't know what it looks like. But, she added with a frown, you think it might be a pencil sharpener. Sorry if I'm being a bit slow here, but didn't your client say? I mean, to be or not to be a pencil sharpener's hardly a grey area.
It changes shape, he said. That's what he told me. It can be one thing one day and something else the next. He only knows it's really the same thing because it's always been kept in its box. Once it's out of the box, I imagine there's no obvious way of telling it apart from any old bit of brass junk you might find at a car boot sale. Unless, of course, he added forcefully, you happen to be a world expert on objects of that kind, like me.
She smiled sourly at him. So, you do know what it is?
Yes.
Fine. By the look of it, she didn't like him much either. So what is it?
I'm afraid I can't tell you that.
Oh, well, he thought.
Never mind. You must understand. I have a duty to my existing client, and the object in question does belong to him after all.
Oh, fine. A disapproving look, as though he was global warming, nuclear weapons, GM crops, and the deforestation of the Amazon basin all rolled into one. There's this incredibly dangerous, shape-shifting magic thing on the loose that might hurt loads of innocent people, but your lips are sealed because your very rich client wants his toy back. I don't think that's a terribly responsible attitude, do you?
Polly.
He'd forgotten about Mr. Meyer.
Just shut up, will you?
Yes, but...
Shut up.
And it worked, remarkably. Having achieved this miracle, Mr. Meyer gave him a very sad look and said,
The man I sent away, is he dead?
Mr. Goggerty shook his head.
I don't think so,
he replied.
So we can get him back?
Mr. Goggerty hesitated. Now, he could lie and be reasonably sure of Mr. Meyer's full cooperation. He could give Mr. Horse back his ring today, though without the box. And be sure of his most lucrative client's sincere gratitude and a cheque with notes on it like a child blowing bubbles. He was in this business to make a living, not to right wrongs. The red cape and inside-out underwear, the blue phone box, the lobbing of enchanted bling into volcanoes, that sort of stunt he left to others, noblemen with ideals and private incomes. On the other hand, Ms. Polly Bloody Mayer had a point. Furthermore, she'd taken her point and stuck it right up his conscience, and he didn't like that one bit. Something he knew was badly wrong, and if Mr. Huss's ring was what he thought it was, feared it was, as long as the wretched thing was out there, it could only get worse, and furthermore, someone had burned down the Carpenter Library. Much as he'd have liked to, he couldn't overlook that. So,
I don't know,
he said.
I believe that if your pencil sharpener turns out to be the item my client is looking for, we should be able to undo what happened to Mr. Briggs.
Mr. Mayer looked as though he was about to burst.
We can get him back.
We can get back something,
Mr. Goggerty said,
but not necessarily what you sent away.
Which quite obviously wasn't what either of them had wanted to hear. They looked at him helplessly, like would-be passengers gazing through the window of a bus, pulling away just as they reached the stop. Then Mr. Mayer said,
Oh.
Mr. Goggerty took a deep breath.
If this thing's what I think it is, he said, it will all depend on whether we can provide the answer to a question. Now, if we can, or maybe well, if not...
A question? Polly Mayer was back in town. What do you mean, a question?
A question,
Mr. Goggerty repeated.
That, if my theory's correct, is what the artefact wants. If we can answer the question, there's a good chance things will sort themselves out. If not, he shrugged, it's not quite as clear-cut an issue as you would like to think, Ms. Mayer. If we can't answer the question, my client might as well have the item as anyone else. He's owned it for quite a while, and this is the first time it's caused any trouble, and only because it managed to get away from him. It could well be that it's as safe with him as it's possible for it to be. And yes, he added, with a faint smile, Then I'd get paid my substantial fee, so at least someone would be happy. You wouldn't begrudge me that, would you, Miss Mayor? As it happens, I've worked very hard indeed to get this far.
Ms. Mayor scowled at him and then sighed. I suppose not. But never mind about that. How do we find out what this stupid question is?
Oh, I know that, Mr. Goggerty replied sadly. Everyone knows the question. It's the answer that's the problem. It has been all along.
Oh, for pity's sake,
Mr. Mayor interrupted, jumping up and inadvertently treading on the discarded pizza tray.
If I hear one more cryptic utterance, I'm going to start biting people. If you know this bloody question, tell us what it is. Then, if we don't know the answer, we'll look it up on Google or Wikipedia. I suppose you've been so busy chasing around the place doing magic, it's never occurred to you to try something so obvious and so simple.
Actually,
Mr. Goggerty said mildly,
I did try it once just to see what would happen.
And?
I got 2 answers, Mr. Goggerty said, but I knew them already. There are only 2 possible answers, you see. The difficulty lies in choosing which.
Mr. Mayor bared his teeth. It was almost certainly an empty, melodramatic gesture, but Mr. Goggerty had been around long enough not to take that sort of risk.
All right, he said. The question is this. Which came first?
Miss Mayor groaned. You can't be serious. But Mr. Goggerty nodded and grinned.
I'm afraid so. That's the question you need to answer. Which came first, the chicken?
He folded his arms and leaned back in his chair.
Yo, the egg.
I'm quite glad I didn't have any chickens, speak to do today, because I don't think I could have done vampire kebabbing. It just reminded me of a time way back a couple of decades when I was younger, and we kind of just went to a nightclub. Now, I was never one for clubbing, not at all. I'm just not that way inclined, but it was just some sort of big event or something, somebody's birthday or something like that. Anyway, one of the guys was actually a chicken farmer, and big 6'7" bass player guy was, and he not only was he absolutely conquered, right? So imagine all these metalheads and punks and goths and everybody going to this trendy nightclub, just basic little town nightclub and stuff. And then he was trying to get it in, and he's this big looming, tall guy. And he was part of the band of one of my exes. And he just went to the front and went, "One adult, please." Sorry, that was my dog Ellie. She wants some attention. But the thing is, right, so of course he wasn't going to be let in. And instead he went, "I would like to go and get a kebabu." Yeah, I think you had to be there, but... You see, now I'm laughing, my dog's going, "What are you doing, mama?" So it's time to skip off. Let me know how you're doing. Let me know how things are. I'm sorry it wasn't the best chapter for my voice quality. Please excuse me, I'm doing my best. But hopefully back either tomorrow or the next day with another chapter. I really want to kind of get through and get this finished for you, and I'm so sorry it took me so long. But I think you can hear the problem. Oh, so much going on. But please tell me how you are. Tell me how things are going. Tell me what's going on. Have a little bit of a chit chat in the comments section. All say hi to each other, follow each other. You know how it goes. If you can, subscribe, share, hit the notifications bell. Very much appreciated. It keeps the lights on, keeps the fans going, and keeps me making this content for you. And I do appreciate you all very, very much for listening to my babbling and waffling and whiffling and stuff. I've got to think of a tune, and I can't think of one. I can't even remember the Hong Kong Phooey tune. How terrible is that one? Yeah. So I can't think of one right now. You know when you want to do something, your mind goes completely blank. But yes, I need to get this rendered and get it up and published for you guys, and then we can crack on. And again, I'm sorry, and big love, and take care of yourselves, and let me know how things are going. And I truly, truly very much appreciate you. Stay safe, pal. Talk to you soon. I'm so sorry.